I'm Elena Vasquez, 47 years old, and 3 weeks ago I watched my former boss present my award-winning sustainable housing design to the city council as his own creation. But what Meridian Architecture did to bury the truth and protect their golden boy was even worse. If you've ever had your work stolen by someone with more power, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of professional betrayal. 22 years ago, I walked into my first architecture job carrying a portfolio case that weighed more than my confidence. Fresh out of graduate school with a master's in environmental design, I was one of only 3 women in my program and the only Latina. My professor, Dr. Catherine Silves, had pulled me aside after my thesis presentation on affordable eco-housing and said something that still gives me chills. "Elena, you have the rare gift of seeing solutions where others see problems. Don't let anyone convince you to think smaller." She connected me with Jackson Webb, a principal at Meridian Architecture who was just starting to explore sustainable design. Jackson became more than my first boss. He became my mentor, showing me how to navigate client meetings, teaching me to trust my instincts when contractors tried to cut corners, and most importantly, how to fight for designs that mattered. Under his guidance, I learned that architecture wasn't just about creating beautiful spaces, it was about solving human problems with creativity and precision. During those early years, I threw myself into every project with the intensity of someone who knew she had to prove herself twice as hard. I spent weekends learning new design software, stayed late to perfect construction drawings, and volunteered for the challenging projects that others avoided. My breakthrough came during my 4th year when I was assigned to renovate a historic community center in East Austin. The building was crumbling, the budget was impossible, and the neighborhood association was skeptical of our young, predominantly white firm. But I saw potential in those weathered brick walls and soaring ceilings. I proposed innovative solutions that preserved the building's character while incorporating modern accessibility and energy efficiency. The project won the Texas Society of Architects Award for Historic Preservation and was featured in Architectural Digest. More importantly, it became a thriving community hub where families gathered for quinceañeras and kids attended after-school programs. Jackson stood next to me at the award ceremony, his hand on my shoulder, and said, "This is exactly why I hired you. You understand that our job is to serve communities, not just clients." The next decade built my reputation as Meridian's go-to architect for complex community projects. I designed a net-zero elementary school that became a model for the district, transformed a defunct shopping mall into affordable artist housing, and created a disaster-resilient community center in hurricane-prone South Texas. Each project taught me something new about balancing budget constraints with environmental responsibility, working with diverse community stakeholders, and turning seemingly impossible sites into thriving spaces. My designs were featured in magazines, I spoke at conferences, and younger architects sought my mentorship. The firm promoted me to senior associate, then to principal, and finally to design director. I had my own team of 12 talented architects and interior designers, a corner office with north-facing windows perfect for reviewing drawings, and the kind of professional respect that takes decades to build. Jackson often joked that I'd become his most successful protege, and I felt deeply grateful for the foundation he'd helped me build. Those were the golden years when everything seemed to align perfectly. My marriage to David was strong, our daughter Sophia was thriving in high school, and I felt like I was making a real difference in the world through architecture. I remember walking into the office each morning feeling energized by the challenges ahead, whether it was convincing a skeptical planning commission to approve our latest innovative design or mentoring a young architect struggling with their first major project. The team I'd built was phenomenal, creative, dedicated professionals who shared my passion for sustainable design and community-focused architecture. We worked on projects across Texas and into New Mexico, always pushing the boundaries of what was possible with limited budgets and ambitious goals. Industry publications regularly featured our work, and I was invited to serve on design review boards and sustainability committees. I felt secure in my position, valued by my colleagues, and proud of the legacy I was building. The office hummed with creative energy, and I loved the sound of heated design discussions, the scratch of pencils on trace paper, and the satisfied sighs when we finally solved a particularly challenging spatial problem. But change was stirring beneath the surface, subtle at first like hairline cracks in a foundation that you don't notice until the damage spreads. Jackson, now in his early 70s, began talking more frequently about succession planning and retirement. The firm's younger partners, led by someone I'd initially welcomed as a colleague, started having closed-door meetings about strategic direction and market positioning. James Rothschild had joined Meridian 5 years earlier as a lateral hire from a prestigious New York firm, bringing with him impressive credentials and an MBA from Wharton. He was charming, articulate, and skilled at impressing clients with polished presentations and strategic business insights. Initially, I appreciated having someone who could handle the business development side while I focused on design excellence. But gradually, I noticed subtle shifts in office dynamics, how conversations would pause when I entered conference rooms, how project assignments seemed to flow through James rather than through our established protocols, and how clients increasingly directed their questions to him even when discussing my projects. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in March. I arrived at the office at 7:30, stopped by the coffee station where our office manager Carla was arranging fresh pastries from the bakery down the street, and settled at my drafting table to review the latest drawings for what would become the center of this entire nightmare, the Riverside Commons project. This was my dream commission, a 200-unit affordable housing development that would incorporate every sustainable design principle I'd spent 2 decades perfecting. Solar panels integrated seamlessly into rooflines, rainwater collection systems hidden within landscaped courtyards, natural ventilation strategies that would eliminate the need for air conditioning most of the year, and community spaces designed to foster connections between neighbors. The project had been in development for 18 months, and the City Council was scheduled to review our final presentation in 2 weeks. I'd poured my heart and soul into every detail, from the orientation of buildings to maximize winter solar gain to the selection of locally sourced materials that would age beautifully while supporting regional economies. My career had been built on a foundation of trust, mentorship, and the belief that good work would always be recognized and rewarded. Growing up in a family where my father worked construction and my mother cleaned office buildings, I understood that respect had to be earned through excellence and integrity. My parents had sacrificed to help me through architecture school, and I'd never forgotten the weight of their investment in my future. This shaped my approach to every project. I documented everything meticulously, collaborated generously with colleagues, and always gave credit where it was due. When younger architects contributed ideas to my projects, I made sure their names appeared on award submissions. When contractors suggested cost-saving modifications, I listened carefully and incorporated their expertise into final designs. This collaborative approach had served me well throughout my career, building strong relationships across the industry and establishing my reputation as someone who elevated every project through teamwork and shared vision. But as I would soon discover, my greatest professional strength, my trust in others and belief in collaborative design, had also created my biggest vulnerability. I'd never encountered someone who would systematically exploit that trust for their own advancement, someone who would view my generosity as weakness rather than strength. The architecture profession had always felt like a community where ideas were shared freely and credit was given fairly. Yes, there was competition for projects and recognition, but I'd never experienced the kind of calculated deception that was about to unfold. I'd heard stories from colleagues about project theft and design plagiarism, but they seemed like cautionary tales from a more cutthroat era of the profession, not something that could happen in my carefully cultivated professional world. The company culture at Meridian had always prided itself on being different from the stereotypical architecture firm. Jackson had built the practice on principles of collaboration, sustainability, and community engagement. We didn't have the ego-driven star system that dominated many larger firms, where senior architects hoarded the best projects and took credit for their team's work. Instead, we operated more like an extended family of creative professionals, sharing resources and expertise across projects. Morning meetings in our main conference room were lively discussions where anyone could contribute ideas, regardless of their position in the firm hierarchy. We celebrated each other's successes, whether it was Sarah's innovative structural solution for a challenging renovation or Miguel's beautiful hand-drawn construction details that impressed even the most demanding contractors. This culture of mutual support and shared success had attracted talented architects who could have worked anywhere but chose Meridian because they valued substance over ego. However, even our progressive culture couldn't completely escape the subtle patterns of favoritism and old boy networking that plagued the profession. I'd noticed over the years how certain types of projects, the high-profile civic buildings, the corporate headquarters, the museum additions, tended to flow toward the male principals, while community-focused work like schools and housing developments somehow became women's specialties. It wasn't overt discrimination, but rather a series of seemingly innocent decisions that reinforced traditional hierarchies. When potential clients toured our office, they were more likely to be introduced to James or the other male principals, even when their projects aligned perfectly with my expertise. Board appointments and speaking opportunities at major conferences somehow favored the same familiar faces. These patterns frustrated me, but I'd learned to work within the system, building my reputation through excellence rather than politics and trusting that good work would eventually speak for itself. Looking back now, I can see warning signs that I dismissed at the time as normal growing pains in a changing organization. James had begun inserting himself into client relationships I'd cultivated over years, claiming he needed to better understand our portfolio for strategic planning purposes. He scheduled coffee meetings with my key contacts, ostensibly to discuss firm-wide initiatives, but always seeming to steer conversations toward his own projects and vision. He'd started attending design team meetings for projects he wasn't directly involved with, offering suggestions that subtly redirected conversations away from my leadership and toward his preferred approaches. When I mentioned these concerns to Jackson, he assured me that James was simply trying to learn our methods and that his business development skills could help all of our projects reach wider audiences. "Elena, you've always been generous about sharing your expertise," Jackson told me. "James is just eager to contribute to the firm's success." I wanted to believe this explanation, but a nagging intuition told me something more calculated was happening. The crisis began on what should have been a routine morning review of the Riverside Commons drawings. I'd arrived early to make final adjustments to the presentation materials, expecting a productive day of polishing details and preparing for our upcoming city council appearance. The office was quiet except for the hum of plotters in the back room and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I spread the large format drawings across my work table, admiring how 18 months of intensive design development had culminated in a comprehensive solution that balanced aesthetic beauty with environmental performance and affordability. The site plan showed how buildings were positioned to create intimate courtyards while maximizing views to the nearby creek. Elevation drawings revealed how traditional Texas architecture could be reimagined with modern sustainable technologies. Detail sheets demonstrated innovative approaches to natural cooling and rainwater management that could be replicated in affordable housing projects across the region. As I was reviewing the landscape plans, James appeared at my workstation with his laptop and a cup of coffee, wearing the kind of confident smile that I'd initially found charming, but had recently begun to interpret differently. "Elena, I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to get your thoughts on something before the team meeting," he said, setting his laptop on my table without waiting for permission. "I've been working on some alternative presentation approaches for Riverside Commons, and I think I've found a way to make our design narrative even more compelling to the council." He opened his laptop and began scrolling through a PowerPoint presentation that made my stomach drop. The slides were beautiful, professionally designed, and completely wrong. He'd taken my sustainable design strategies and reframed them as cost-cutting measures rather than environmental innovations. The community engagement process I'd spent months facilitating was reduced to a single bullet point about stakeholder buy-in. Most disturbing, he'd repositioned the entire project as an example of market-responsive affordable housing rather than the community-centered, environmentally regenerative development we'd actually designed. "James, this isn't our project," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced to understand what was happening. You've completely changed the design narrative and missed the point of everything we've been working toward." He looked puzzled, as if my concern was unreasonable. "Elena, I think you're being a bit precious about the messaging. The important thing is getting council approval, and this framing emphasizes the economic benefits that will resonate with their priorities." I stared at him, realizing that he either fundamentally misunderstood our design intent or was deliberately misrepresenting it. The economic benefits are important, but they're secondary to the environmental and social benefits. This project is supposed to demonstrate that affordable housing can be a catalyst for community building and ecological healing. Your presentation makes it sound like a generic development that happens to be cheap. James closed his laptop with a slight sigh, the kind of patronizing gesture that suggested I was being difficult rather than protective of design integrity. "I think we should discuss this with Jackson. Maybe we need a fresh perspective on the presentation strategy." That phrase, fresh perspective, hit me like a physical blow because I suddenly understood what was happening. This wasn't a collaborative discussion about presentation strategy. This was a takeover. James wasn't suggesting improvements to my work. He was positioning himself to present my work as his own vision. The realization was so shocking that I couldn't immediately respond. I'd spent my entire career in environments where ideas were shared freely and credit was given fairly. The possibility that a colleague would systematically appropriate my work had never occurred to me because it violated every professional norm I understood. But as I watched James gather his laptop and head toward Jackson's office, I realized that my trust and collaborative spirit had been expertly manipulated by someone who saw them as opportunities rather than values. The meeting in Jackson's office 30 minutes later confirmed my worst fears. James had already briefed Jackson on his concerns about the presentation approach, framing my objections as resistance to necessary strategic adjustments. Jackson, who'd always been a supportive mentor, seemed confused by what he perceived as a conflict between two valued colleagues over presentation details. "Elena, I think James raises some valid points about emphasizing the economic benefits," Jackson said, clearly uncomfortable with having to mediate between us. "The council is under pressure to show fiscal responsibility, and we need to make sure they understand how this project delivers value." I tried to explain that James wasn't just suggesting presentation changes, but was fundamentally misrepresenting the project's goals and my role in developing them. But as I heard myself speaking, I realized how my concerns might sound like petty jealousy over presentation credits rather than substantive disagreements about design philosophy. James sat quietly during my explanation, occasionally nodding with the kind of sympathetic expression that suggested he understood my emotional attachment to the project but hoped I could see the bigger picture. When I finished, he spoke with the calm authority of someone presenting reasonable solutions to unnecessary problems. "Jackson, I completely understand Elena's passion for this project. She's done incredible work developing the design, and I want to make sure that comes through clearly in our presentation. My only concern is that we're not framing the benefits in language that will resonate with the council's decision-making process. Maybe we could find a way to incorporate both approaches, Elena's vision for community impact and a clear business case for approval." It was a masterful response that positioned him as a collaborator seeking compromise while subtly establishing his authority over the presentation strategy. Jackson seemed relieved by James's diplomatic approach and suggested we work together to refine the presentation over the next week. "This project means too much to all of us to let presentation disagreements derail our chances for approval," he said. "Elena, you know this design better than anyone, and James, your strategic perspective has been valuable on other projects. I'm confident you can find a way to present our best work effectively." As we left his office, I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. Everything Jackson said was reasonable, but the underlying dynamic had shifted in ways that I couldn't articulate without sounding paranoid or territorial. James had successfully positioned himself as the strategic thinker while reducing me to the role of passionate, but possibly unrealistic designer. The collaborative relationship I'd thought we shared had been revealed as something much more manipulative and calculated. The next phase of the nightmare began with what seemed like routine project coordination, but gradually revealed itself as systematic isolation designed to remove me from my own work. James suggested that we divide responsibilities to maximize efficiency. He would handle all client communications and presentation development, while I focused on technical refinements to the drawings. This seemed logical on the surface, but it effectively cut me off from direct contact with the city planning staff and council members I'd been working with for months. Emails that had previously come directly to me were now routed through James, who would forward selected information along with his own interpretations and recommendations. Phone calls from planning staff were redirected to his extension, and I often learned about important project discussions secondhand through brief summaries that seemed to miss crucial details. The isolation extended beyond client communications to internal project coordination. Design team meetings for Riverside Commons began happening without me, with James explaining that he wanted to streamline the decision-making process and would update me on any significant changes. When I protested that I needed to be involved in design decisions for my own project, he expressed concern that my emotional investment might be interfering with objective assessment of necessary modifications. It was a devastating critique because it contained just enough truth to be credible. I was emotionally invested in the project because I cared deeply about its success, while completely ignoring the professional expertise that made my involvement essential rather than optional. My access to project files began experiencing mysterious technical difficulties. Shared network folders that I'd been able to access for months suddenly required permissions that only James seemed able to grant. CAD files became corrupted when I tried to open them, requiring me to request current versions from team members who seemed uncomfortable with the awkward position they'd been placed in. Email threads about important project decisions somehow failed to include me, and when I asked to be added, I was told they were internal strategy discussions that would be summarized for me later. My login credentials for the project management software expired and took days to be renewed, during which time crucial decisions were made without my input. These technical problems could have been coincidences, but their frequency and timing suggested a more deliberate pattern of exclusion. The psychological impact of this isolation was more devastating than I had expected. I began questioning my own perceptions and wondering if I was overreacting to normal project management adjustments. James was always polite and professional in our interactions, expressing sympathy for the technical difficulties I was experiencing and assuring me that he was working to resolve them quickly. He praised my design work while suggesting that my skills might be better utilized on other projects where I could have more creative control. The message was clear. I could continue to be a valued member of the firm if I accepted a reduced role on Riverside Commons and trusted him to represent our shared work effectively. It was a sophisticated form of gaslighting that made me doubt my own professional judgment while systematically removing my authority over work I'd created. During this period, I tried to maintain connections with team members who were working on construction documents and technical details, hoping to stay informed about project developments through informal conversations. But I noticed that my colleagues seemed increasingly uncomfortable when I asked about the project, often giving brief answers and changing the subject quickly. Sarah, one of my most trusted associates, finally pulled me aside after a particularly awkward encounter and explained what was happening. Elena, James has been telling the team that you're going through some kind of professional crisis and that we should be supportive but not burden you with project details that might increase your stress level. He said Jackson asked him to take over client communications to give you space to work through whatever you're dealing with. People are confused because you seem fine, but they don't want to get caught in the middle of whatever's happening between you and James. This revelation was both validating and terrifying. It confirmed that my isolation was deliberate rather than accidental, but it also showed how effectively James had manipulated the narrative to make my marginalization seem like compassionate management of a colleague in crisis. By the time I understood what was happening, he'd already established himself as the project leader while positioning me as someone who needed protection from the pressures of major client presentations. Any attempt to reclaim my authority would now be interpreted as evidence of the instability he'd already suggested to the team. It was a brilliant strategy that used my colleagues' genuine concern for my well-being as a weapon against my professional standing. I realized that I needed to document what was happening and seek advice from someone outside the firm who could help me understand my options. I began keeping detailed records of email exchanges, noting patterns in communication and decision-making that demonstrated my systematic exclusion from the project. I reached out to Dr. Silves, my former professor, who listened carefully to my description of events and suggested that I contact an employment attorney who specialized in workplace issues in creative professions. Elena, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated form of professional sabotage, she told me. The architecture profession has a long history of women being marginalized from their own work, but it's usually more subtle than what you're experiencing. You need legal advice about how to protect yourself and your intellectual property. The consultation with attorney Rebecca Martinez was both enlightening and sobering. She explained that creative professionals often had limited legal recourse when their work was appropriated by colleagues, especially when the appropriation happened gradually through changes in project responsibilities rather than obvious theft. However, she advised me to document everything and consider whether there might be grounds for claims related to gender discrimination or breach of employment contract. Most importantly, she warned me that challenging James directly without careful preparation could result in retaliation that would damage my career prospects. Elena, you're dealing with someone who's planned this carefully and has positioned himself strategically within your firm. If you're going to fight back, you need to be smarter and more prepared than he is. And you need to accept that this fight might cost you your current position regardless of whether you win or lose. The advice was sobering because it forced me to confront the reality that my comfortable career at Meridian was probably over regardless of how the Riverside Commons situation resolved. James had demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and manipulative skill that would make future collaboration impossible. Even if I managed to expose his behavior and reclaim credit for my work, the trust and mutual respect that had made Meridian feel like home had been permanently damaged. I was 47 years old with a mortgage, a daughter approaching college, and a reputation that could be destroyed if I handled this situation poorly. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the odds seemed increasingly stacked against me. But I also knew that I couldn't simply accept what was happening without fighting back. The Riverside Commons project represented everything I'd worked toward as an architect: the integration of environmental responsibility, social justice, and design excellence that could serve as a model for affordable housing across the region. More importantly, my willingness to accept this theft would signal to other women in the profession that such behavior was acceptable and could be repeated without consequences. I thought about the young architects on my team, particularly the women who were just beginning their careers and looking to me as an example of what was possible in the profession. What kind of message would I send if I allowed my life's work to be stolen without resistance? The trap was set with the precision of a military operation, beginning with an impossible deadline that seemed designed to create grounds for performance complaints. 2 weeks before the City Council presentation, James informed me that the planning department had requested significant modifications to the site plan that would require comprehensive redesign of the building layouts, parking arrangements, and landscape systems. The changes were substantial enough to require weeks of work, but had to be completed in time for the presentation printing deadline 3 days away. I know it's a tight timeline, Elena, but the planning staff made it clear that these modifications are non-negotiable if we want council approval. James explained with the kind of sympathetic concern that made him seem like an ally rather than the person creating the impossible situation. The requested modifications were technically feasible, but would require coordinating with structural engineers, landscape architects, and mechanical consultants who were already committed to other deadlines. More problematically, the changes would fundamentally alter the community spaces and environmental systems that were central to the project's design intent. I suspected that the modifications weren't actually required by the planning department, but were James's own improvements to the design, presented as external requirements to avoid direct confrontation about design decisions. When I asked to speak directly with planning staff to clarify the requirements, James explained that they were too busy with council preparation to take calls from individual team members, and that all communication needed to go through him as the primary project contact. I spent the next 72 hours in a state of focused desperation, working with my team to redesign major portions of the project while trying to maintain the sustainability features and community benefits that made it meaningful. We worked in shifts, with some team members staying late while others arrived early to continue the work. The office took on the intensity of a disaster response, with coffee cups accumulating on desk surfaces and Chinese takeout containers stacked in the break room. Despite the exhaustion and time pressure, there was something energizing about working together toward a shared goal, and I remembered why I'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. The collaborative problem-solving that transforms constraints into creative opportunities. But even as we worked miracles to meet the deadline, I realized that success would be interpreted as evidence that the timeline had been reasonable rather than impossible. If we failed to complete the work, it would be documented as my inability to manage project demands effectively. James had created a no-win situation where my options were to fail publicly or succeed in a way that validated his authority to impose unreasonable demands. The psychological pressure was enormous because I knew that my team's effort and creativity were being exploited to strengthen the case against me, but I couldn't abandon the project without providing even stronger evidence of professional inadequacy. During this period, I also discovered that James had been meeting separately with key team members to assess their concerns about project management and ensure they felt supported during this stressful period. Sarah confided that he'd asked detailed questions about my leadership style, decision-making process, and ability to handle pressure, all framed as caring concern for team well-being, but clearly designed to gather ammunition for future performance discussions. Other team members reported similar conversations where James had expressed worry about my increased stress levels and suggested that they bring any concerns directly to him rather than adding to my burden. It was a masterful divide-and-conquer strategy that isolated me from my own team while positioning James as their advocate and protector. The final piece of the trap was revealed when Human Resources contacted me about scheduling a performance review meeting to discuss recent project challenges and development opportunities. The timing, just days before the City Council presentation, was clearly intended to maximize pressure and minimize my ability to prepare an effective response. The HR representative, Linda Patterson, explained that several colleagues had expressed concerns about my recent work quality and collaboration style, and that the review was intended to provide support and guidance rather than disciplinary action. But the language of the meeting request made it clear that my job was in jeopardy and that the performance issues had already been documented and discussed without my knowledge or input. I realized that I was facing a coordinated campaign designed to remove me from the firm while creating legal protection against wrongful termination claims. James had spent months building a narrative of declining performance and professional instability, gathering testimony from colleagues who thought they were helping a struggling peer, and creating documentation that would support whatever personnel action the firm decided to take. The beauty of his strategy was that it used my colleagues' genuine care and professionalism against me. They provided ammunition for my destruction while believing they were participating in a supportive intervention. The night before the performance review meeting, I sat in my home office surrounded by project files, legal documents, and timeline charts that documented the systematic appropriation of my work. David found me there at 2 a.m, staring at my computer screen where I'd been drafting a response that seemed inadequate to address the complexity of what I was facing. "Elena, you look like you're preparing for war," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the patient expression of someone who'd been watching this crisis unfold for weeks. "Maybe it's time to consider whether winning this battle is worth the cost of fighting it." His concern was genuine and his advice was probably wise, but I couldn't accept the idea of walking away without at least trying to expose what had happened. "David, if I don't fight this, it sends a message to every woman in this profession that this behavior is acceptable." James didn't just steal my work. He developed a systematic approach to marginalizing a successful female colleague that could be replicated against anyone who threatens the status quo. "I have to try to stop this. Not just for me, but for everyone who comes after me." David nodded slowly, understanding that this had become about more than just my career or even my specific situation. "Then we fight smart, and we make sure we have enough evidence to win. Because if you're going to challenge someone who's this calculating, you can't afford to lose." That conversation crystallized my understanding that I needed to shift from defensive reaction to strategic offense. Instead of simply responding to James's allegations and manipulations, I needed to build a case that exposed his pattern of behavior and demonstrated the calculated nature of his campaign against me. I had been thinking like an architect, focused on solving the immediate problems in front of me, when I needed to think like a lawyer, building a comprehensive argument supported by irrefutable evidence. The performance review meeting would be my opportunity to present that case, but only if I could gather enough documentation to support my claims. I spent the remaining hours before dawn compiling emails, meeting notes, project timelines, and witness statements that demonstrated the systematic nature of my exclusion from Riverside Commons. The evidence was compelling when viewed as a pattern, but I worried that individual incidents could be explained away as normal project management decisions or misunderstandings between colleagues. I needed something more definitive, a smoking gun that would make James's intentions undeniable and force the firm to acknowledge what had been happening under their supervision. The performance review meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room, the same space where I'd presented dozens of successful projects over the years and celebrated team achievements. Linda Patterson had arranged the seating so that I faced a panel consisting of herself, Jackson, and James, a setup that immediately signaled this was an interrogation rather than a supportive discussion. The morning light streaming through the north-facing windows highlighted the dust particles floating in the air, and I found myself thinking about how many important conversations had taken place in this room and how different this one felt from all the others. Jackson began with a statement that attempted to frame the meeting as a constructive conversation about professional development, but his discomfort was obvious as he read from prepared notes that reduced our 20-year relationship to formal HR language. Elena, we've called this meeting because several colleagues have expressed concerns about recent changes in your work quality and collaboration style. We want to understand what's been happening and explore ways the firm can provide better support for your professional success. The words were kind, but the structure of the meeting made it clear that my version of events was considered suspect and that the decision about my future had probably already been made. James presented the case against me with the polished confidence of someone who'd spent months preparing his arguments. He expressed genuine sadness about having to raise concerns about a respected colleague, then methodically outlined a pattern of behavior that painted me as increasingly unstable and unprofessional. According to his narrative, I had become possessive of the Riverside Commons project, resistant to collaborative input, and unable to handle the pressure of major client presentations. He cited specific incidents that sounded damning when stripped of context. My objections to his presentation changes became resistance to strategic guidance. My attempts to maintain client relationships became territorial behavior. And my documentation of his exclusionary tactics became paranoid record-keeping that was concerning other team members. The most devastating part of his presentation was how he'd recruited my own colleagues as witnesses to my alleged decline. He read quotes from team members expressing worry about my stress levels, confusion about my changed behavior, and concern about the impact on project quality. These weren't malicious colleagues trying to harm me. They were genuinely caring people who'd been manipulated into providing evidence against me while believing they were helping address a colleague's personal crisis. Sarah's comment that I seemed overwhelmed by project demands, and Miguel's observation that I was spending more time on documentation than design work, became proof of professional incompetence rather than reasonable responses to systematic sabotage. When James finished his presentation, Linda Patterson asked if I had any response to the concerns that had been raised. This was my moment, the opportunity I'd been preparing for since I'd first realized what was happening. I opened my laptop and began presenting the case I'd spent weeks building, starting with a timeline that showed how my exclusion from Riverside Commons had been systematic rather than random. I presented email chains that demonstrated how James had gradually taken over client communications, meeting notes that showed his pattern of scheduling important discussions without me, and technical issues that had mysteriously resolved themselves once he gained access to project files. But as I presented my evidence, I could see that it wasn't having the impact I'd hoped for. Jackson looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly struggling to reconcile his image of James as a collaborative colleague with my allegations of calculated manipulation. Linda Patterson took notes, but seemed more focused on my emotional state than the substance of my arguments. Most discouragingly, James listened with the patient expression of someone waiting for a disturbed colleague to finish an unfortunate outburst so that rational discussion could resume. My carefully compiled evidence was being interpreted as confirmation of the paranoid behavior he'd already described to them. The turning point came when I accused James directly of appropriating my work and systematically excluding me from my own project. His response was masterful in its apparent reasonableness and wounded professionalism. Elena, I'm genuinely sorry that you've interpreted my efforts to support the project as somehow undermining your role. I've tried to handle client communications and presentation development precisely because I could see how much stress you were under and wanted to help you focus on the design work you do so brilliantly. If my efforts to be helpful have been misunderstood, I apologize, but I have to say that these accusations are completely unfair and frankly hurtful. I've done nothing but try to ensure the success of work that we've all contributed to. It was a perfect response that positioned him as the victim of my unreasonable accusations while subtly reinforcing the narrative of my mental instability. By expressing hurt rather than anger, he appeared to be the rational professional dealing gracefully with a colleague's breakdown. By emphasizing his supportive intentions, he made my allegations seem like paranoid misinterpretations of normal project management. And by referring to work that we've all contributed to, he subtly claimed shared ownership of the Riverside Commons design while appearing generous about collaborative credit. The meeting concluded with Linda Patterson explaining that the firm would need to carefully consider all the information that had been presented and would follow up with next steps within a few days. The language was careful and formal, but the meaning was clear. They believed James's version of events and were preparing to take action against me. As we filed out of the conference room, Jackson approached me with the kind of sympathetic expression reserved for difficult conversations. Elena, I hope you'll consider taking some time off to get the support you might need. The firm values your contributions, but we're all concerned about the stress you seem to be experiencing. It was a kind way of suggesting that I seek professional help for mental health issues rather than continuing to pursue my allegations against James. I left the meeting knowing that I'd failed to convince them and that my position at Meridian was now untenable. But I also realized that something important had happened during my presentation. James's response had been too smooth, too perfectly calibrated to be entirely spontaneous. He'd anticipated my accusations and prepared responses that were designed to discredit me while maintaining his image as a reasonable professional. This suggested that he was more calculating than anyone realized and that his behavior toward me might be part of a pattern that could be exposed if I could find other evidence or witnesses. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Rebecca Martinez, the employment attorney I'd consulted weeks earlier. Elena, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have some questions that might help us understand whether there are legal remedies available to you. Can you come in this week to discuss some additional strategies? Her tone suggested that she'd discovered something important, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope that this nightmare might not end with my professional destruction. The meeting with Rebecca revealed information that changed everything I understood about my situation at Meridian. She'd done some research into James's background and discovered that he'd left his previous firm in New York under circumstances that suggested a pattern of problematic behavior toward female colleagues. Elena, there were 2 women at his previous firm who filed complaints about work appropriation and professional sabotage, but the cases were settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. I've managed to speak confidentially with one of them, and her experience is remarkably similar to what you've described. James appears to have developed a sophisticated method for marginalizing successful women while making himself appear to be the victim of their unreasonable behavior. This revelation was both validating and terrifying. It confirmed that I wasn't paranoid or overreacting, but it also revealed that I was dealing with someone who'd perfected his techniques through previous victims. Rebecca explained that the patterns she'd identified might provide grounds for a discrimination lawsuit, but warned that such cases were difficult to win and could damage my reputation even if successful. Elena, you have to decide whether you want to fight this publicly or try to negotiate a private resolution that protects your reputation while getting you out of this situation. Both approaches have risks, but staying and trying to work with James is not a viable option given what we now know about his history. The decision was agonizing because it forced me to choose between my principles and my practical needs. Fighting publicly might expose James and protect other women from similar treatment, but it would also mark me as a troublemaker in an industry where reputation was everything. Accepting a private settlement would protect my career prospects, but would allow James to continue his behavior with future victims. I thought about the young women on my team and the message I wanted to send about standing up to workplace predators. I thought about my family's financial security and my own professional future. Most of all, I thought about the Riverside Commons project and whether there was any way to save it from being corrupted by James's misrepresentation. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah approached me in the parking lot after work, looking around nervously to make sure we weren't being observed. "Elena, I need to tell you something that might help your situation. Last week, James asked me to help him prepare the final presentation for Riverside Commons, and I discovered something really disturbing. He's been systematically removing your name from project credits and replacing your design narrative with his own interpretation. But more importantly, he's planning to present the project as his own work to the City Council. I have copies of the presentation files that show the changes, and I think you need to see them." The files Sarah shared with me were the smoking gun I'd been looking for, clear evidence that James intended to claim full credit for the Riverside Commons design at the City Council presentation. The original presentation materials, which I developed over months of work, had been comprehensively edited to remove any reference to my role in the project. My name appeared only as a team member while James was listed as principal architect and design lead. More damaging, he'd completely rewritten the design narrative to emphasize his strategic business insights while minimizing the community engagement and environmental innovation that had been central to my approach. But Sarah had given me more than just evidence of plagiarism. She'd also provided me with information about the presentation logistics that revealed an opportunity for public exposure. The City Council meeting was open to the public and would be broadcast on local television. If I could find a way to present the true history of the project during the public comment period, I could expose James's deception in a forum where he couldn't control the narrative or limit access to information. It would be risky because it would end any possibility of a private resolution, but it would also ensure that the truth about the Riverside Commons project was preserved for the public record. The night before the City Council meeting, I sat in my home office making final preparations for what I knew would be the most important presentation of my career. I'd prepared a concise but comprehensive explanation of my role in developing the Riverside Commons design, supported by documentation that would be difficult for James to refute. I'd also prepared myself emotionally for the consequences of public confrontation, knowing that challenging James in such a visible forum would probably end my career at Meridian regardless of the outcome. David and Sophia had both offered to attend the meeting for moral support, and I was grateful for their willingness to stand by me during what was likely to be a very difficult experience. The City Council chambers were more crowded than usual, with representatives from neighborhood associations, affordable housing advocates, and local architects who'd come to observe the presentation of a project that had generated significant community interest. I sat in the back row, watching as James set up his presentation materials with the confident efficiency of someone who'd never doubted his right to represent the work. Jackson sat in the front row with other firm principals, and I wondered if he had any idea what was about to unfold. The council members reviewed their agendas and chatted quietly among themselves, unaware that they were about to witness a professional confrontation that would expose fundamental problems in the architecture industry. James's presentation was polished and persuasive, incorporating many of the design strategies I developed while completely misrepresenting their origins and intent. He spoke confidently about his approach to sustainable affordable housing, his innovative community engagement process, and his vision for creating developments that would serve as regional models. The council members listened attentively and asked thoughtful questions about construction costs, maintenance requirements, and replication potential. It was everything I'd hoped for when I'd first envisioned this moment, except that the person receiving credit for the work was sitting in my chair and speaking from my notes. When the formal presentation concluded and the chair opened the floor for public comment, I approached the podium with documents in hand and my heart racing. Good morning, council members. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm the architect who actually designed the Riverside Commons project that was just presented to you. The room fell silent, and I could see James's face register shock and then calculation as he realized what was happening. I'm here today because the presentation you just heard fundamentally misrepresented both the design intent and the authorship of this project, and I believe you deserve to know the truth before making your decision. For the next 10 minutes, I presented a comprehensive account of my role in developing the Riverside Commons design, supported by dated drawings, email records, and witness statements that demonstrated my authorship of the key innovations James had claimed as his own. I explained how the sustainable systems had been developed through months of collaboration with environmental consultants, how the community spaces had been designed through extensive neighborhood input sessions, and how the overall concept reflected years of research into affordable housing best practices. Most importantly, I revealed how James had systematically excluded me from the project presentation while appropriating credit for work I'd created. The reaction in the council chambers was immediate and dramatic. The council members looked confused and concerned, clearly unsure how to process this unexpected challenge to information they'd just received. James stood up and attempted to interrupt, claiming that I was experiencing personal difficulties that were affecting my judgment, but the chair firmly told him to remain seated until the public comment period was completed. Jackson looked stunned, as if he was finally understanding the true nature of the conflict he'd been trying to mediate for weeks. Most gratifying, I could see several audience members nodding in recognition, including some who'd participated in the community engagement sessions I'd facilitated and could verify my account of the design development process. When I finished my presentation, James was given an opportunity to respond. His rebuttal was less polished than his original presentation, clearly improvised in response to accusations he hadn't expected to face in such a public forum. He acknowledged my contributions to the project while maintaining that he'd served as the lead architect throughout the design development process. He suggested that my public accusations reflected professional jealousy and personal instability that had created difficulties for the entire design team. But his explanation sounded defensive and calculated compared to the detailed documentation I'd provided, and several council members pressed him for clarification about specific design decisions that he clearly couldn't explain with the authority of someone who'd actually developed them. The most damaging moment came when Councilwoman Rodriguez asked James to explain the rationale behind the building orientation and solar panel placement, technical decisions that were central to the project's sustainability claims. His response was vague and generic, revealing that he didn't understand the site analysis and climate considerations that had informed these critical design choices. When she asked if I could provide additional clarification, I was able to give a detailed explanation that demonstrated intimate knowledge of every aspect of the design development process. The contrast was stark and undeniable, making it clear to everyone present who had actually created the work being discussed. The council chair announced that they would defer their decision pending clarification of the authorship questions that had been raised, and suggested that Meridian Architecture provide additional documentation about project leadership and design development. As the meeting adjourned, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. I'd succeeded in exposing James's deception and protecting the integrity of my work, but I'd also created a public scandal that would have unpredictable consequences for everyone involved. James avoided eye contact as he packed up his presentation materials, but I could see the fury in his rigid posture and quick movements. Jackson approached me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between disappointment and concern. Elena, what you've done here today is going to have serious consequences for everyone involved, Jackson said quietly. I hope you understand that this isn't something the firm can just move past quietly. His tone wasn't threatening, but it was clear that my public confrontation had forced the firm into a crisis that would require decisive action. I understood that my position at Meridian was now completely untenable, but I also knew that I'd prevented James from stealing credit for my life's work and had created a public record of his behavior that would protect future potential victims. The immediate aftermath of the city council confrontation was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, I received a termination letter citing unprofessional conduct and breach of workplace collaboration standards. The letter made no reference to the substance of my allegations against James, focusing instead on my decision to air internal conflicts in a public forum without following proper company procedures for dispute resolution. It was carefully crafted legal language designed to protect the firm from wrongful termination claims while positioning my firing as a reasonable response to insubordinate behavior rather than retaliation for exposing workplace misconduct. But my public exposure of James's behavior had also triggered consequences that the firm couldn't control or contain. The local architecture community was small and interconnected, and word of the council chamber confrontation spread quickly through professional networks. Several colleagues reached out privately to share their own experiences with James's manipulative behavior, creating a pattern of corroboration that validated my accusations. More importantly, the city planning department announced that they would be conducting their own review of the Riverside Commons project to ensure that proper credit was given to all contributing architects before proceeding with approval. Rebecca Martinez had prepared me for the possibility of termination and had already begun exploring legal remedies for both the workplace discrimination and the intellectual property theft I'd experienced. The public nature of my confrontation with James actually strengthened my legal position by creating witnesses and documentation that would be difficult for Meridian to dispute. Elena, what you did was risky, but it's also created the kind of public record that makes settlement much more likely, she explained. James can't claim this is just a misunderstanding between colleagues when there's video evidence of him presenting your work as his own creation. The legal process moved more quickly than I'd expected, partly because Meridian was eager to resolve the situation before it attracted more media attention or regulatory scrutiny. Within 6 weeks, we'd negotiated a settlement that included financial compensation, positive references for future employment, and, most importantly, a public acknowledgement of my authorship of the Riverside Commons design. James quietly left the firm shortly after the settlement was announced, and I later learned that he'd moved to another state where his reputation hadn't been damaged by the public exposure of his behavior. The professional vindication was emotionally satisfying, but the practical challenges of rebuilding my career at age 47 were daunting. I'd been blacklisted by some firms that viewed my public confrontation as unprofessional regardless of its justification, but I'd also gained support from colleagues who respected my willingness to stand up to workplace predators. Several smaller firms reached out with project opportunities, and I began to realize that my reputation for integrity might actually be more valuable than my previous corporate position had been. The most unexpected opportunity came from the city planning department, which offered me a consulting contract to oversee the final development and construction of Riverside Commons. They wanted to ensure that the project maintained its original sustainability and community engagement goals, and they believed that my deep involvement in its creation made me the ideal person to guide its implementation. It was a chance to see my design vision realized without the corporate politics that had nearly destroyed it, and I accepted the position with gratitude and excitement. Working directly with the city and the community organizations that would benefit from Riverside Commons reminded me why I'd become an architect in the first place. Without the pressure to generate profits for firm partners or impress corporate clients, I could focus entirely on creating housing that would genuinely serve the people who would live there. The construction process was challenging, as all building projects are, but every problem we solved brought us closer to realizing a vision that had survived corporate betrayal and legal battles to become something real and lasting. The project's completion 18 months later was marked by a community celebration that felt like both a professional triumph and a personal healing. Families toured their new homes, children played in the courtyards I'd designed for safety and community building, and elderly residents relaxed in shaded seating areas positioned to encourage social interaction. The solar panels and rainwater collection systems worked exactly as I'd envisioned, providing residents with lower utility costs and greater environmental sustainability. Most importantly, the development had already become a catalyst for additional community improvements, exactly as I'd hoped when I first conceived the design. Standing in the central courtyard during the celebration, watching residents interact with spaces I'd created specifically for their needs, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional recognition or career advancement. This was what architecture could achieve when it focused on human needs rather than corporate profits, when it served communities rather than just clients. The betrayal and legal battles that had brought me to this point seemed worthwhile because they'd led to work that was more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished in my corporate career. But the personal cost of fighting for professional integrity couldn't be minimized. The stress of the confrontation with James, the uncertainty of unemployment, and the challenges of rebuilding my career had taken a toll on my family relationships and my own mental health. David had been supportive throughout the crisis, but our marriage had been strained by the financial pressure and emotional intensity of the legal battle. Sophia had watched her mother's career implode during her senior year of high school, an experience that had shaped her own views about professional risk-taking and workplace justice. The healing process was gradual and ongoing, requiring me to rebuild not just my career, but also my trust in professional relationships and my confidence in my own judgment. I'd learned that workplace predators like James were skilled at exploiting the collaborative spirit and generous nature that made someone effective at community-focused design work. Protecting myself from future manipulation would require maintaining some level of professional skepticism that felt antithetical to the open collaboration I valued. Finding the balance between self-protection and professional effectiveness became an ongoing challenge that influenced every new working relationship. As I reflect on this experience 2 years later, I'm struck by how much my understanding of professional success has changed. I used to measure achievement through promotions, project awards, and recognition within the architecture establishment. Now I'm more focused on the actual impact of my work on the communities it serves and the example I set for younger architects who face their own workplace challenges. My consulting practice is smaller than my previous corporate position, but it's also more aligned with my values and more directly connected to positive social outcomes. The Riverside Commons project has become a model for affordable housing developments across the region, demonstrating that environmental sustainability and community building can be integrated into housing that's genuinely affordable for working families. 3 similar projects are now in development using design strategies I pioneered at Riverside, and I've been invited to speak at conferences about the integration of sustainability and social justice in affordable housing design. This professional recognition is more meaningful than any corporate award because it's based on work that's making a real difference in people's lives. Perhaps most importantly, my willingness to fight James publicly has encouraged other women in the profession to speak up about their own experiences with workplace discrimination and intellectual property theft. I've been contacted by dozens of female architects who've faced similar challenges, and I've been able to connect them with legal resources and professional support networks that can help them protect their work and advance their careers. The personal cost of my confrontation with James has been offset by its contribution to broader changes in professional culture that will benefit the next generation of women architects. The architecture profession still has systemic problems with gender discrimination and the devaluation of work that serves social rather than commercial purposes. Male architects continue to receive disproportionate credit for collaborative work. Women are still steered towards soft specialties like housing and community development, and firms still prioritize profit-generating projects over community-serving design. But the conversations about these issues are becoming more open and honest, partly because people like me have been willing to speak publicly about experiences that were previously hidden by shame and professional fear. I've learned that fighting for professional integrity requires accepting significant personal and financial risk, but it also creates opportunities for more meaningful work than would be possible within corrupt systems. The corporate position I lost at Meridian provided financial security and professional status, but it also required me to operate within power structures that ultimately protected predators like James at the expense of their victims. My current independent practice is less predictable financially, but it's also more aligned with my values and more directly focused on projects that improve people's lives. The legal victory against James was satisfying, but the real victory has been discovering that it's possible to build a successful career while maintaining personal integrity and serving community needs. The young architects who work with me now understand that professional success doesn't require accepting workplace abuse or compromising their values to advance within traditional firm hierarchies. They're learning to document their work carefully, build networks of mutual support, and speak up when they witness or experience discriminatory behavior. For anyone facing similar workplace challenges, I want to emphasize that fighting back is risky but possible, and that there are resources available to help protect your work and your career. Document everything, build relationships with colleagues who share your values, seek legal advice early when you recognize problematic patterns, and remember that your professional integrity is more valuable than any single job or client relationship. The architecture profession needs people who are willing to prioritize community service over corporate profit and social justice over professional advancement. Most importantly, remember that your work as an architect has the potential to improve people's lives in lasting and meaningful ways. Don't let workplace predators or corrupt corporate cultures prevent you from pursuing the projects and professional relationships that align with your values. The profession needs your voice, your perspective, and your commitment to creating built environments that serve everyone rather than just the wealthy and powerful. If you've experienced workplace discrimination or intellectual property theft, please share your story in the comments. Your experience matters, and speaking up helps create the professional accountability that will protect future generations of architects. Subscribe for more content about workplace justice and community-focused design practice. Together, we can build a profession that values integrity, collaboration, and service to community needs over corporate profits and individual ego. Your work matters, your voice matters, and your willingness to fight for what's right can create positive change that extends far beyond your own career.